So in 1991, when I was 6, I took a class called Mass Media and Popular Culture at San Jose State University, where I'm a graduate. And in walks this extremely dynamic human being that sort of rocked everybody's world for an entire semester. And then I had the great good fortune of becoming friends with James. And so I credit a lot of my communication knowledge and a lot of my communication understanding to this particular human being, and I am not going to take up any more of his time because I'm sure that you will be blown away by James Lull.
Blown away. I can't promise blown away. But I'm very happy to be here. Nice to see you all. Thanks for showing up for this topic. And Julie, thank you very much for arranging it. It's always good to talk to folks about things that I've been thinking about, writing about. And I took early retirement from San Jose State. When the students, after Julie's group went through, when social media came in, and that became a real challenge for university professors to compete with that in a certain way when they're checking their messages under the desk and so forth. That was one thing. But there just comes a point where you realize that I've taught this class enough, I'm going to do other things, and I've always thought of myself primarily as a writer anyway. So what I've been doing over the past, well, throughout my career has been writing books that have to do one way or another with the power of communication. And I don't mean that strictly in an ideological sense, stimulus, response, cause and effect. Here come the imperialist forces that are going to bring conformity to the world. No, I have a different view of it. It's a kind of an informed optimism that I try to employ in all of my thinking and my writing. And that comes from actual experience in being really impressed by the way in which human beings, you and me and everybody else, find ways to employ the material and the symbolic resources around them to their advantage. So, for example, just as one example, I studied, in the 1980s I was working in China a lot, and I studied the impact of the Chinese telecommunications system, which was being modernized and nationalized at the time by Deng Xiaoping as a big part of the program for improving the communication across the country in China. And they install a very powerful national television system, and they expect the people to just go along with whatever they have to tell them. And of course, what you find out when you interview families, which is what we did over a period of years, 86 families in their homes, unsupervised, was that you hear people talking about, well, how they make sense of the television programming. And a lot of it was resisting the government's ideas and so on. So it is that spark of humanity, that spark of independence, of free thinking, of the ability to interpret apart from the dominant theme that is being prescribed, that encourages me. And when we think about those kinds of experiences, which are inspiring, because after all they do speak to our ability to innovate, think for ourselves, think outside the box, and create worlds that are not being prescribed, where does that come from? And the way in which I have finally in my career been able to pull it all together is by looking at evolutionary theory and how it is that human beings got to where we are today, along with all the other organisms that surround us on this planet. So it was reading, actually, word for word, page by page, The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin's book, about 12 years ago, because I always knew I was an agnostic, atheist, free-thinking person, but at the same time I had never really brought the most fundamental theoretical program I could into my writing. So I would write about symbolic creativity, the power of individuals to transform symbolic forms into their own messages. We call this appropriation in cultural studies and media studies. Take what somebody gives you, turn it into something else for your own purposes. Where does that skill come from? And these are the things that have been interesting me from the time that I started my media research and right down into reading Charles Darwin and all the work that's come since then. And I've written a number of books. You're welcome to check them out on my website, which is just www.myname.com, jameslull.com. Well, if we look back in our evolutionary history, even 400,000 years ago, what we find is that human beings have an innate curiosity and an innate ability to find those resources, including material resources like rocks, that we can turn into flakes so that we can carve the carcasses of animals in order to be able to extract the marrow and eat the meat in a better way. These are the very first instances that we can see in the evolution of our ancestors, where we could say that they were using their kind of innate creativity to create tools. So this goes through many of you are better versed in this than I am, I'm sure, about the particulars of evolutionary history. But the whole idea here that the human being has this kind of capacity for independent thought is very, very old idea indeed. I mentioned China a while ago. This is a photo that I took in Shanghai in the 1980s, during a time when the Chinese government was really prescribing to everybody exactly what they're supposed to do through the media, including billboards like this one. The public space was really a kind of an ideological space that the government was using in order to try to bring about this kind of conformity. They were even using this kind of material in order to eliminate the meetings that they would hold in neighborhoods so that they could do it more economically without having to have everybody go to these meetings all the time. They were going to communicate with them through TV and through other media, including billboards. So this billboard tells them, obey the rule of law in China, go along with the program and the authorities that prescribe the program. But what we see here underneath that billboard is the other side of it. Here's the structure in which these people live still, although much more flexible today, certainly than it was in the 1980s. And here's agency, if we use this kind of structuration theory from sociology, where you have a dynamic relation between structure and agency. I always come down on the side of agency because that's where life is. That's where change is. So this woman is selling on her own on the street in an entrepreneurial fashion tea eggs. Tea eggs are hard-boiled eggs that are immersed in tea so that the tea kind of soaks into the eggs. They're chilled, and then people eat those as sort of snacks in the afternoon on the streets in China. So here you have agency and structure in one scene, and as I say, I like to err on the side of agency of the individual. Sorry about there's so much light in this room, these slides don't show up as well as they might. Here are a couple of women who are in Hawaii, and they're on vacation. One of them has decided that she's going to use her camera phone to take a picture of a lei that she has spread out very nicely on the sand. And she's probably going to paste that on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or whatever, wherever. Or maybe she's just going to save it, make an album of it for her friends back home. Who knows? But what she's doing is acting symbolically, creatively in her own, with her own agenda, using the technology and the material and symbolic resources that are available to her. So for me, this is inspirational, because it puts in the hands of individuals not just this democratization that the internet and social media bring about, that we talk about in many ways politically, but also from a cultural standpoint, the capacity to enrich her potential as a kind of media producer. Because in a sense, what she's doing is what a television station would do. making images, transmitting them to desired locations and so forth. That's inspiring too, and we take it for granted. Just two people taking a picture, arranging things the way that they'd like. Let's go to Venezuela for a moment, the Andes Mountains between Colombia and Venezuela. I work in Latin America a lot. After my Chinese work in the 1980s, in the early 1990s, I shifted pretty much into Latin America and have been going back there every year for the last 20 years at least, more than that. This individual who is on the cross here is Dr. Jose Gregorio Hernandez. This medical doctor is a very, very important person in the little pueblos, the tiny little villages that dot the Andes, beautiful Andes mountains there in this border territory. He is considered by the local people to be a kind of saint, because at the turn of the 20th century, he came into that area with his medical degree, with his medicines, with his great knowledge, with his communication skills, with his kindness as a doctor, and he attended to people who needed help. And he actually cured people, and he gave them preventative medicine, and he just became a kind of a Jesus Christ figure for them. So why not combine the cross of Jesus and Dr. Hernandez, put them in one place? You get 1 and 1 equals 3. It empowers this kind of feeling of gratitude, even to the point of religiosity, that the people in that particular area have toward that doctor. This is a great act of hybridization of symbolic forms done by common people. This is not imposed from above. Like change, evolutionary change, it always comes from the bottom. The big theme that Obama used during his campaign, of course, was that you grow your potential bottom up rather than imposing it top down. So here's a great example of that, and I've tried to show you these various examples that we've seen: the Chinese woman, the man making the tool, the girl taking the photograph. All of that is empowered from the bottom up. Good stuff. Now, in the field, just a few words about communication as a discipline. Some of you are academically oriented and have backgrounds, maybe taught, maybe are teaching at whatever level of education. Others not. Within our field of communication, we have this very interesting issue about, are we an art or are we a science? So let me reflect for just a moment on a little bit about the tradition of our field. If we're going to talk about the science of communication, then what do we mean by that? Is it really a science? A lot of people think, well, no, it's really mainly an art, more than a science. And there is a strong tradition that backs that argument. The art of communication traces its roots to ancient Greece. Well, ancient Greece isn't that ancient when you think in evolutionary terms, certainly. But, of course, the great Greek philosophers and the establishment of democratic principles in Greece, together with the rhetorical public speaking element, the development of argument, of logic and reasoning that went into what would later become, of course, the Enlightenment. But the kind of thinking that they were doing, which was scientific in the broad sense back then, but really more oriented around art and the ability of the speaker to be able to communicate well to the audience. Focusing on the audience, by the way. So we're developing a kind of communication system. Speaker as the sender of the messages, audience members as the receivers of messages, and then whatever channels are used in order to get that message, those messages out there. Source, message, channel, receiver, the essential elements of a communication system. So we've got art, and it continues that way. I got my PhD from the University of Wisconsin from the Department of Communication Arts, because rhetoric and public address, the history of civil movements and the role of political speech in those movements is a very big part of what that department does, and it's a very well respected department. However, after World War II, there came a change to the field of communications, and the scientific element was added in. This was because social psychology, sociology, anthropology, political science, economics, these fields, a lot of people were interested in communication within their fields. And they were doing kinds of scientific work to try to determine how the role that communication plays in economics, in politics, in social life in general. So many communications departments sprung up during this time period, using social psychology basically as their foundation. And for the last, 60 or 70 years, there has been a scientific orientation to the field of communication studies, and it has as its background the material that I've just discussed. In fact, I was looking at a book called Communication Theory the other day, and there are 80 theories in there that are scientific theories, but they're almost all from these other related fields that kind of feed into the notion of the science of communication. There was one barrier during the 1970s and 1980s as well. If you remember, the famous book by E.O. Wilson called Sociobiology scared everybody into thinking, not everybody, but the universities tend to be leftist. I consider myself to be essentially kind of part of the progressive side of the academic world too, which we usually associate with leftist politics. But there's a political correctness that comes in there that can be pretty blind sometimes. And that notion that biology could somehow play a role in communication, that was off limits. Because that was going to be offensive. We're in post-World War II, fascism is still in the mind. We're into the mentality in the 50s and the 60s that it could be that this kind of genetic determinism that sort of falls out of biology may be leading to racism, to sexism, to all kinds of negative things of social hierarchies, better than you, worse than you kind of thinking. And this, of course, is very dangerous. So there was a reason for intellectuals to resist in a certain way the science of communication, particularly if it moved over toward anything having to do with biological elements. But biology is in fact the foundation upon which communication exists. So we have to backtrack now. We lost some time, and it's very difficult to do because these norms are very much established within the field. You can't talk about biology in communications much because it still makes people nervous. But above all else, communication is a biological and cultural phenomenon. Now, where's the determinism in there? Yes, there are things that are determined about our bodies biologically. Let's say that the probabilities increase tremendously within certain areas of our biological functioning. But the cultural side of this is where the choices exist. So we do not have to accept any kind of our biological tendencies as a sophisticated culture. We can decide to act, in a sense, against those tendencies. I'm going to give you some examples of that as we roll along in here. Of course, in order to appreciate the biological element as the foundation of human communication, we have to realize that you've got to go back. You've got to go way back. 3.5 billion years, in fact, to the arrival of the first forms of organic life, the simple single-cell bacteria that existed at that time, and we want to take a look at those. And as we do that, here in a second, we need to remember that as you read Darwin or anyone else knows what they're talking about with evolution, what we're here to do basically is to survive and reproduce. The two driving motives for all of life and how things move forward. Survive and reproduce. Life is not limited to survival and reproduction, but these are the foundations that come from biological instincts that we have and that are encoded into our DNA. Survive and reproduce. All right, so let's see where all this starts. Sorry about the quality of this image. It's just a mock-up that I have for a publisher now in a new book that I'm doing. This is a single simple bacteria cell. And what I want to try to emphasize in this particular moment is that bacteria contain the very first forms of life to appear on Earth 3.5 billion years ago, contain all the elements of a communication system that we have in our bodies, that we have in our cultures, in our societies, that technology makes possible in certain ways, like a television program being received by somebody at home who then, all of those elements there, source, message channel, receiver, you can find them, and you can find them from the very beginning. So bacteria cells, the simple cells, provided a kind of template upon which communication becomes the driving force of human evolution. That is my argument. And I'm going to say that there's sort of two parts. The second part we'll be talking about more later, and that is that it isn't just a matter of competition and survival of the fittest in that most grotesque way of thinking about brutal competition, but that cooperation is just as vital to our sense of survival and reproduction as is any kind of direct conflict-oriented competition. So, the two big points I would like you to take away from here today, if nothing else, one would be you can go back 3.5 billion years to see the template for communication which exists in all organisms today. And you can understand that to survive and reproduce, we don't just have to be in conflict mode, survival of the fittest, the kind of stereotype that goes against Darwin and evolutionary theory in general. We have to be in cooperative mode. Cooperative mode is really, ultimately, how we are able to exist. So just briefly, when a bacteria cell is attempting to survive and reproduce, what it does is it reads external signals from its environment, the other bacteria that are surrounded. When this particular cell, here, this is the membrane of the cell, which contains receptor proteins on the outside and integral proteins on the inside. It receives a chemically infused signal from the outside. It recognizes there's another bacteria cell here that is like me. It joins with that cell, and that goes on and on and on, and they form microbacterial communities of a sort, working together in order to achieve their goals. And of course, these are not conscious goals, but these are goals that are driven in part by this communication phenomenon. Working together extends the potential of their life within the host mechanisms, host organisms in which they're a part. Inside, so we have communication from outside, then we have communication on the inside as the cell informs itself of what's going on out there and what its potential is. Some of you know about the honeybee phenomenon, that honeybees are great communicators. They communicate to each other in an organized way in order to develop a community and survive as a community. So the so-called scout honeybees go out, they find a source of food somewhere, they come back to the hive, and they do what's called, and you can find this on YouTube, I thought about incorporating, but there's just not enough time, the waggle dance, where they just move their butts around in a certain way, pointing toward where the food is that they found, to inform the rest of the members of the hive where the food is. They also move at a certain rhythm. If they move fast, that means the food is close. You can use your energy to go there fast. If they move slowly, that means the food is far away. Conserve your energy, go out there and come back. They also come back with pollen attached to their bodies, which is then transmitted, another form of communication, through the smell to the other bees. They're giving the bees insight into what kind of food is out there. So they're developing external and internal forms of communication. They're communicating to each other, and they're also developing a kind of information recall in their own system so that when they go out, they know what they're doing. I don't know about you, but I find this kind of stuff pretty fascinating. And, you know, because you can see from the bacteria to the honeybee, and we'll take it now to something a little bit more familiar, our own ancestors 400,000 million years ago, and there are some, it's hard for you to see with all the light here. There are men down here who are attempting to bring down a mammoth, and they are doing so by coordinating their actions in order to make that happen. This is what we might call human cooperative communication, which is established on that very template from the bacteria down through all the rest of the organisms that are filtering their way off into all directions as evolution makes this incredible spread of flow of life forms. And they have to have certain understandings. The men that are involved here have to have certain understandings among themselves. And this is where we draw the line between humans and other life forms. As humans are better able to, even in the case of our ancestors, to communicate their intentions, to communicate what they know. They develop norms of sharing information. They are able to focus jointly on particular tasks and coordinate their efforts to achieve those goals, those objectives that they have. They even have a kind of a cooperative reasoning or logic that develops in their DNA that allows them to do that, along with the signaling capacity that they have. The very first forms of communication. And of course, it's impossible to know for sure, but because there's no fossil trace that is left of vocal communication or gestures for that matter. But they're likely to have been, and you see this with kids, they're likely to have been things like pointing, there's an animal there in the bush, and then mimicking what kind of animal it is. Maybe making the sound that the animal makes or the movement that the animal makes, sharing information. That kind of information sharing happens among humans, not among other life forms to such an extent. Chimpanzees have certain capacities to share information, but they're always retreating back to their self-interest. Whereas we have a much more global view, even back this far in our history. But it isn't just hunting and bringing down animals, it's also child raising requires cooperative communication. And so here we have a demarcation male-female issue, which of course is problematic in terms of how we would like to arrange our gender roles in a modern society. We'll get to that in just a second. But what point I want to make here is that communication is good for the community. What happens is that the necessity to communicate comes from the necessity to organize. The necessity to organize socially is a survival tactic from that starts with the individual, then develops and builds into the social networks that are created. And then these social networks are created so that they find ways to communicate. They're being pressured, evolutionary pressure, to communicate to each other what to do. And as they get better at communication, they get better at cooperation. That makes them better at communicating again. The complexity arises on both sides, and you have a co-evolutionary spiral of communication and cooperation. This is a very inspiring idea. Because if we project to the future, which is why I like to think about all of this, is, you know, hopefully down the line we can communicate and cooperate and break down our tribal boundaries more effectively than we've been able to do so far. And boy, aren't there challenges to that. I'm not naive about this. I understand communication works in many directions. But the positive potential has a long track record. And so I prefer to sort of keep moving and keep the discourse in that direction. And it's not for no reason. You know, children have perfectly good interest in cooperating even when they're very young. Even as infants, they will work together. they'll also fight and do everything else, but they will work together. They show real interest in respecting each other's point of view in a very crude sense and working together on projects, for example. And then look what happened here in Silicon Valley when Facebook and the other social media companies, high-tech companies in general, were developing. What you have are these kind of boy-oriented groups that were cooperating with a common goal of being able to make something very important happen in terms of technology. This is a kind of natural male domination that comes from nature. It doesn't have to stay like that, but there's reasons that it is like that. If you look back, the very way that our bodies were formed as males and females, the dimorphic differences among us owe to differences between us as sexual beings. Now then the sex roles that go along with that lead to gender roles and gender expectations, and then we've got a mess. Because as we become more sophisticated culturally, we have the capacity to overcome that. And of course, one of the main discourses here in the Silicon Valley these days is exactly that, gender equality in the high-tech industries. So here we go back to the biological and cultural interface, right? The biology drives us in one direction. The culture is like a safeguard where we can stop the biological tendencies. We don't have to repeat the past. We can invent a future that is more productive. And in fact, those countries and those societies where women have greater access to everything and are more participating in the economic and the political worlds of those particular countries are the ones that are doing better. It's in a nation's best interest to find gender equality. So it isn't just a moral issue. There are actual economic factors that come into that as well. Okay, that's kind of the survival side. Now let's look more over at the reproduction side for a minute, how it is that that communication is so important for the reproduction of life. This, and I'm dealing in some stereotypes here, because the incredible wing spread of the tail spread, actually, of the peacock is the stereotype of the male reproductive display. Hi, ladies, here I am. How do you like this spread right here? Not only is it enormous and beautiful, but it's full of eye spots, and the eye spots terrify predators. So not only am I beautiful, I can scare away big animals that want to come and eat us here. This is a way for him to display his fitness to females who then make a decision next year. Or, yeah, look good, come on over. It's that kind of a situation where we have female choice determining reproductive processes within the natural world in general. The female makes herself conspicuously present. The male makes a display of his fitness, or at least the appearance of his fitness. And you got to watch those men, those males, because they can look like something that they're actually not. So, and you know, birds and other animals figure this out. And the mating ritual then goes from the female's presence, the male's display, to the female's acceptance of the male's display. And that's how babies are made. Mark Zuckerberg, when he started Facebook, what did he do? If you remember the movie, the first thing that he said was that the big breakthrough in Facebook was when he realized that putting relationship status on the page was really going to get people to be interested. Because it was relationship status. Are you available? Yeah, you're pretty, but are you available? Yeah, you're handsome, but are you available? That whole thing sparked the takeoff for the whole Facebook phenomenon, and in fact, it drives a lot of activity in social media in general. So what we have then is sexual communication being a dominant discourse within our media. Obviously, sexual advertising and all of that. And in fact, if we take it into the human realm again, we see that the very first form of external body decoration were these perforated shells that they found in the Blombos caves, the famous ones in South Africa, which perforated and hung together and used as necklaces and as bracelets. And you know, most anthropologists and others who are studying this believe that this was for sexual, to adorn oneself, to make oneself more sexually appealing, males or females. Probably males first and foremost at the beginning of it. Tattooing, all kinds of things that happen, and tattooing goes way, way back as well. Body disfigurement, the machismo displays that males come up with, even things like heavy metal music and fast cars and all of that. It all kind of plays out in a certain way as male fitness displays. I'm powerful, I've got money, I've got a beautiful car, I've got energy, I'm the man for you. I want to go to the second part of the presentation now, which is less me and more video. And Julie's going to give me a hand up here in a second, Julie. I'll call it if you want to come up now, but I'll need you in just a second. Just a word about science education before we get off this topic of the science of communication. As you've heard, we have a big problem in this country with the science education. Not just as a problem in schools, but as a problem really in our culture. That science is not sufficiently recognized as, you know, the way forward, the best way to take steps forward. Where we're using evidence and logic and reasoning and arguments that can be tested and competed within the scientific platform, or even just within a logical platform of everyday people. There's plenty of room for that. But we find in the Pew study, for example, just this year, that we're 29th in the developed world in math and science at high school and elementary schools. The World Economic Forum has us 52nd in math and science. The Broad Foundation this year found that we're 27th in quality college degrees in the STEM areas. And why I worry about this in terms of what I'm talking about today, evolutionary theory and how that's the basis of the science of communication, is that if we don't know that much in our culture about scientific principles, then you take it another level down or up to evolutionary theory, and of course the status weakens even more. We don't know that much about science. We know even less about evolutionary science, even though as kids we all learned that when we were in grade school in a certain way. But there's certain tendencies in the country, some of them driven by religious objections, others driven by the lack of good science education, that downplays the fact that evolution is the foundation of everything you see around us. So a Michigan State University study has us 33rd out of 34 countries in basic knowledge of evolutionary principles and theory. The 34th country in that study was Turkey. All right, now let's move into our second part of our program here, which has to do with watching some YouTube videos. And before we do this one, I want to say that this is the communication of science part of the program this morning, and we are interested in seeing who is being effective at communicating science to our population. And you have to give a lot of credit to the biology teachers, to the science teachers at all levels of education, who are struggling against a lot of barriers, a lot of structural barriers, in order to be able to make that education available. But if we go back and think about, well, who is really getting the education from the Big Bang on forward to how we all really got here and how everything happened the way it did? Very few people get any kind of a comprehensive sense of that. oh, how I would love to have kindergartners and first graders first learn at the very beginning the fundamental principles of evolution so that they can build their entire educational platform on the truth. Instead of just little fragments of nice things to learn, those are all good. But if you could possibly infuse this in people from the very beginning so that it just all makes sense, we'd greatly increase our scientific literacy and our capacity to continue to create a world that might be better for us all. Carl Sagan was a great a proponent of doing this. Stephen Hawking, of course, has become a great popular figure for helping us all make sense of these kinds of things. There is a program for teaching kids in high school called Big History, which some of you may know about, which is absolutely wonderful, that does go back there. But it's in very few schools. Los Gatos High School last year. The communication of science is in the hands of very few people within the scientific community. Frans de Waal, with his work on the bonobos. Bill Nye, the science guy, has been a great figure. Then we go over to the atheist, agnostic side with Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett, the philosopher. These people have all achieved a certain degree of popular awareness that are basically streaming thought in that direction against a lot of objections. But of the contemporaries, maybe there's nobody more powerful than Neil deGrasse Tyson. And I hope you're watching Star Talk on Monday night on the National Geographic Channel. That is 1 hour of must-see TV in the Lull household, I will tell you. And I really recommend it to everybody. So let's listen to Neil give us a little information about one of his episodes here. Enabling space to become a familiar background to us all. How about enabling science to become a familiar background to us all? That's what he's doing. And some of the others that I mentioned. And having some success with that. Now, let me take you to the next one while Julie sets it up, because I got 4 little short bits like that to show you. At the end, he was talking about the astronaut singing, playing his guitar and singing a song to his daughter, happy birthday, whatever, from space, right? So he's invoking music. Another brilliant technique, because communicating science or anything else using music is a very powerful artistic form that connects with everybody, that everybody appreciates, enjoys, remembers. And so some of my other examples have to do with music. This particular example is Björk and her program called Biophilia. Now Björk, some of you may know of Björk. She's an Icelandic singer, fabulous talent, out-of-the-box, original, beautiful, wonderful human being who believes in fusing technology, science, culture, music, all of that together, so that when she does her shows on her world tour, she has everybody sitting in the round around her choir and her performance as a solo artist and her musicians, and the musicians are using instruments that are connected in one way or another to the earth. Like she's got a gravity instrument that they start that moves with the pulses of gravity and makes sounds, so that as she's singing, part of the sound that is coming, the ambient sound within her, the texture of her music is created by actual natural forces. A nice way to connect nature to music, to feeling, to emotion. And she also sends kids out to study this stuff. So when she goes to New York, she goes to San Francisco, she goes to Buenos Aires, she recruits students and teaches them how to program on their tablets and so forth, musical things using natural forces. And it's just a beautiful way for a person of star quality to be able to connect like that. So that's David Attenborough's voice. You may recognize it from his documentaries, and he's a fabulous spokesperson for evolutionary theory and science in general in England, and he's the voice of the BBC whenever they do anything around these kinds of topics. So when you go to a Bjork concert, there we go, then that was the introduction to the concert. You sit down in the round, and that big screen comes with David Attenborough giving you that, then the music starts. So what I'm trying to show you here is that there's tremendous creativity about exposing the beauty and the truth of science that's coming right out of popular culture. Maybe even more so than it's coming out of the scientific community itself. We have some attempts to make that happen. Alan Alda's Communicating Science organization in New York. Alan Alda, of course, famous actor, who has now dedicated the rest of his life basically to trying to help scientists become better at explaining themselves. Because they tend not to be so good at that. A little bit introverted there. So it's just a matter of facilitating the discourse in more powerful ways. To really contact people, and not just folks in the humanist associations, but the broader public, who, for them, just thinking like this is new. It needs to be expanded. Opening those levels of consciousness like we talked about in the 60s, remember consciousness raising? Well, we need that now too, in a certain way, and she's a big part of that. I admire her so much. Okay, hold that one. Oops. Yeah, that's fine. So here's the little, when you go to her concert, she puts it in like museums and stuff. So you come in, and okay, next one, Julie. And you go to exhibits, like in this particular case, she has an exhibit about where the microbes live underneath the sea. So when you go to a concert, you arrive 2 hours early and you go through like a science lab. And then you go into the show and you hear David Attenborough telling you that this is all what's really going on. And then boom, out she comes with this beautiful music and you're blown away. Your life is starting all over again. Because it is really powerful, the way that they've orchestrated this. And it's an ongoing project. So let's move on to the next example. And I want to, oh yeah, there we go. Hold that one for a second, Julie, please. Okay, I got a favorite new band right now, and this band is called Nightwish, and they're from Finland. Such a fascinating country, Finland. This is called a symphonic metal band, and by the way, Mr. Audio, when the music starts, let's really crank it up, okay? The band has written this majestic hour-and-a-half symphony for a heavy metal band, but they also have orchestras, they have a choir from London, it's an incredible thing. And the album is called Endless Forms Most Beautiful. Those 4 words might mean something to those of you who've studied evolution at all, because of course, these are the words from Charles Darwin's final passage in this game-changing book called The Origin of Species. And right here on the Nightwish website, you get that passage. And then the name of the album is Endless Forms Most Beautiful. The title track of the album, which I'm going to play for you here in a moment, that has the lyrics actually appearing right on the screen. So if you can see the screen, you can follow that as well. There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. Darwin didn't know. And that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Oh, how true and how incredibly insightful, given no DNA, no idea what genes are, no real fossil record. Just a brilliant man traveling the world and trying to make sense of it, overcoming the kind of scientific and religious barriers that he was facing in Victorian England. This guy is a hero. Put him on the cross up there with Dr. Hernandez, as far as I'm concerned. So let's listen to the title track from this album. That's powerful, isn't it? Oh, I'm so happy you like that. I love that piece. They were just in San Francisco a month ago and doing this tour. And they're touring the world. The band is called Nightwish. You can find them easily on the web. You can see what their tour is. They're coming back here next spring, so it'd be nice to catch them then. You know, if you can connect that message with the emotion of music, you can touch people, especially young people, in a way that maybe the biology teacher can't quite do. We need all of that. We need all of that together. And so that's why I'm really promoting this sort of channel of influence, the popular culture channel, because it's powerful. Julie just said, I have to tell you that I've been a radio disc jockey in my life. And in fact, I was on Armed Forces Radio Vietnam during the time when Good Morning Vietnam, do you see that movie? Robin Williams played a guy called Abe Cronauer who was on in the morning at 6 o'clock. Well, I was the guy that was on from midnight to 6 during that whole time period. So I was pretty tired at 6 o'clock in the morning. So, Good Morning Vietnam. But by the way, Robin and Adrian were two completely different types of people. Abe was a very quiet guy, and of course Robin Williams is a very effusive personality. I'm going to leave you with one piece here now. This is another piece of music, and we're going to move into rap music. But this is a rap song that's done by a guy called Baba Brinkman, who's had his show just off Broadway in New York for a couple of years. He does 2 or 3 different shows. They're about evolution. There's one about religion, not exactly favorable. Then there's another one that he does about literature. So he's such a talented guy. This guy, by the way, and I offer this to Julie and Martin and everybody who's here who might have an interest, is coming to the Bay Area in the fall. Might be kind of cool to get him around, you know, Palo Alto somehow. So we became friends over a few years ago, and I'm trying to help him arrange venues here. But this is really brilliant stuff, I think. And what he's doing is celebrating Darwin Day. How can we celebrate Darwin Day and get it more into the consciousness of people?
And we have the founder of Darwin Day right here with us today.
Yeah? You'll appreciate this, my friend. That's it. That's my hour. So I understand that you open it up for questions, and again, I'm not a biologist, so don't pin me down too much on the little stuff, on the micros, okay? I'm pretty good with the macros.
So actually, lunch is ready. So are you staying for lunch, Doctor?
What are we going to
do? Are you able to?
Yeah.
You said about 15 minutes.
Okay, so maybe you can answer some questions after, so we don't let lunch go cold. So can I just say congratulations, you're the first person to get rap and heavy rock in a humanist forum for 50 years. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.